Right now, somewhere in your daily routine, there's a habit so small you've never once questioned it, and researchers who study human cognition say it might be quietly broadcasting information about how your brain actually works. Not your IQ score. Not your job title. Something deeper and harder to fake. In 1999, two psychologists at Cornell University ran an experiment that would eventually explain why. They gave people a grammar test, a logic test, and a joke rating test, then asked each person to guess how well they'd done. The people who scored in the bottom 12th percentile, genuinely, factually near the bottom, guessed they'd scored around the 62nd percentile. Better than average. Confidently wrong. That study became known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, and it cracked open a question that's been quietly obsessing cognitive scientists ever since. If people can be this wrong about their own thinking, what other everyday behaviors are secretly leaking the same signal? That's what this is actually about. Not judging anyone. Not a checklist of shame. It's about the strange, well-documented correlation between certain ordinary habits, habits you've probably done today without thinking twice, and how the brain processes, filters, and stores information. And once you see the pattern across cultures, decades, and species, you start to notice it's the same handful of mechanisms wearing different disguises. It gets stranger than you'd expect. Here's the baseline most of us start from. We assume intelligence is something you either have or don't, a fixed number stamped on you in childhood, mostly invisible in daily life until a test drags it into the light. We assume the habits we repeat every day, how we talk, how we plan, how we scroll, are neutral. Just personality. Just preference. That assumption is exactly what a century of cognitive research has been slowly taking apart, one small behavior at a time. Take procrastination. Not the occasional deadline scramble, the chronic kind, the kind that shows up in roughly 20% of adults according to research from Dr. Piers Steele, a professor at the University of Calgary who spent over 2 decades studying delay behavior across more than 24,000 participants. Steele found something counterintuitive. Procrastination isn't primarily a time management failure. It's a battle between two competing brain systems, the limbic system, ancient and impulsive, chasing immediate comfort, and the prefrontal cortex, newer and slower, trying to plan for a future self that doesn't feel real yet. Here's where it gets interesting. The people whose prefrontal cortex loses that fight most often tend to score lower on tasks measuring what psychologists call future discounting, the ability to accurately weigh a reward that hasn't happened yet. Your brain, in other words, is placing a bet on which version of you matters more, the one who feels good in 5 minutes, or the one who has to deal with the consequences in 5 days. Sound familiar? Because this is the exact same mechanism casinos exploit, the same one credit card companies are built around, and the same one that made ancient Roman soldiers, according to military records from the 1st century BC, notoriously difficult to keep on siege duty. Bored men, immediate discomfort, no felt connection to a distant payoff. Then there's language, specifically, the instinct to reach for the biggest, most complicated word available. In 2005, a Princeton psychologist named Daniel Oppenheimer ran a study with a title almost nobody could say out loud without laughing. Consequences of erudite vernacular utilized irrespective of necessity. He took student essays, swapped simple words for needlessly complex synonyms, used, became, utilized, that kind of thing, and had readers rate the writer's intelligence. The result flipped what almost everyone assumed. The more unnecessarily complicated the language got, the lower people rated the writer's intelligence, not higher. Here's the mechanism. Genuine understanding lets you compress an idea down to its simplest form, the way a physicist can explain gravity with an apple, or the way Richard Feynman, who insisted he could only claim to understand something if he could explain it to a room of undergraduates in plain English, built his entire teaching philosophy around that exact principle. Reaching for jargon isn't a sign of depth. It's very often a cover for the opposite, a kind of camouflage that only works on people who assume complexity equals competence. But here's what nobody tells you about multitasking, and this one surprised even the researcher who discovered it. In 2009, Clifford Nass, a Stanford professor who studied human-computer interaction for nearly 25 years, set out to prove that people who juggle multiple screens are better at filtering distractions. He fully expected it. Instead, his team found the opposite, and he later admitted it left him shocked. Heavy media multitaskers performed worse at ignoring irrelevant information, worse at switching between tasks efficiently, and worse at basic working memory tests than people who single-tasked. The brain doesn't actually multitask. It rapidly toggles, and every toggle carries what cognitive scientists call a switch cost, a tiny tax in accuracy and speed. Do that toggle a few hundred times a day, every day, for years, and you're not building a sharper brain. You're training it to operate permanently in shallow mode, a mechanism strikingly similar to what happened, oddly enough, in ancient Rome again. Scribes forced to transcribe multiple dictated letters simultaneously were documented in surviving correspondence from Cicero's household as producing dramatically more errors than those working one letter at a time. Here's a habit almost everyone assumes is harmless: checking your phone. Not using it, just having it nearby. In 2017, a researcher named Adrian Ward at the University of Texas at Austin ran a study with 520 participants, giving them cognitive tests while their phone sat either in their pocket, in another room, or face down on the desk in front of them. The phone was off the entire time in every condition. It didn't matter. Participants with their phone merely visible on the desk scored measurably lower on tests of fluid intelligence and working memory than those whose phones were in another room. Ward called it brain drain, the theory being that some portion of your cognitive bandwidth is permanently, unconsciously allocated to resisting the pull of the device, even when it's silent, even when it's off. You're not being interrupted by it. You're being taxed by the possibility of interruption. And this pattern isn't new. It just used to wear different clothing. Around 370 BC, in Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, Socrates tells a story about the Egyptian god Thoth presenting the invention of writing to King Thamus, expecting praise. Thamus refuses to give it. He argues that writing will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls, because people will stop exercising memory and instead rely on external marks. It sounds almost quaint now, until you meet Betsy Sparrow, a psychologist at Columbia University, who in 2011 ran a study that essentially proved Thamus half right, 2,400 years later. Sparrow found that when people believe information will remain accessible later, saved to a computer, searchable on demand, they remember dramatically less of the actual content, but remember with striking precision exactly where to find it again. She called it the Google effect. Your brain isn't getting lazier. It's doing something it's always done, efficiently offloading storage it doesn't think it needs to keep. The habit changed. The underlying mechanism, deciding what's worth holding onto, didn't. You've got the future discounting problem behind procrastination. You've got the camouflage problem behind complicated language. You've got the switch cost tax behind multitasking. You've got the bandwidth drain behind a silent phone sitting 6 inches from your hand. You've got a 2,400-year-old anxiety about memory outsourcing that turned out to be measurably real. Stack them up and a pattern starts to emerge that has nothing to do with how much someone knows, and everything to do with how a brain manages its own limited, finite attention. Because that's the unifying thread running under every single one of these examples. None of them are really about intelligence in the way we usually picture it: trivia, vocabulary, puzzle-solving speed. They're about metacognition, Your brain's ability to accurately monitor itself, to notice when it's cutting a corner, discounting a future cost, or borrowing confidence it hasn't earned. The people who score worst on the Dunning-Kruger tests aren't unintelligent in the classic sense. They're often just cognitively blind to their own blind spots. The habits that keep showing up alongside lower cognitive performance, across a Roman battlefield, a Stanford lab, a Princeton classroom, and an Egyptian myth 2.5 millennia old, all share one thing. They're what happens when the brain takes the cheapest available shortcut instead of doing the more expensive, more accurate work of checking itself. And maybe that's the real reason this topic hooks people so hard. It's not really about being smart or not smart. It's about the quiet, almost invisible difference between a mind that catches its own shortcuts and one that doesn't notice it's taking any. You started this not knowing where your phone was sitting right now. Maybe it's face up on the table beside you. Maybe you've already thought about checking it twice since this began. That's not a flaw in you. It's the same ancient, overworked machinery that convinced a Roman scribe he could copy 2 letters at once, that convinced Socrates writing would ruin memory, that convinces almost all of us, almost every day, that we're thinking more clearly than we actually are. The habits were never really the point. They were just the tracks left behind by something far harder to see directly. The mind, quietly deciding, thousands of times a day, what it thinks is worth its own attention.